Shadows of the Eternals was announced way back when in 2013, more than a decade after the release of Eternal Darkness. It's been in development limbo ever since, but a part of me likes to think that this game will eventually come out for the public to experience. It's being headed by the original creators of Eternal Darkness, so I thought I'd look back on that game and examine what it does well and what it does wrong. I have a good deal of respect for Eternal Darkness, but I do think it's far from perfect. It's a game that lingers in your memory because of the sum of its parts, but the individual components could do with a lot of polish. If the team behind Eternal Darkness were willing to get started on a spiritual successor 13 years later, I'm willing to gamble that at least one of them would still be interested in crafting a sequel. Without ties to big business, they'd really be free to craft the sort of game they'd like to make, so if it's a spiritual successor thereafter, it only makes sense to go back and look at the things that could be improved upon. This is going to be an in-depth look at Eternal Darkness, so in other words, this editorial isn't to inform your purchase. If you have any desire to play this, then I strongly urge against watching this video, as it's more for folks who've already played it. I'm not going to explain what anything is, believe me, there's a lot of weird terminology for this one. I'm just going to assume you know what I'm talking about, so fair warning. The main thing I'm mainly going to be looking at is how the game handles its mechanics. Story, graphics, and that sort of thing are going to be taking a back seat, though I'm sure it's inevitably going to be seeping into the analysis anyway.
You don't play this game, it plays with you. Eternal Darkness, only for Nintendo GameCube.
Deep into that darkness peering, long I stood there, wondering, fearing, doubting.
The game focuses on 12 different characters across a time span of 2 millennia. It has a love of history, mystery, and the works of H.P. Lovecraft. Though the final game was released on the Nintendo GameCube, its development cycle began on the Nintendo 64, and it shows in both the game's scale and presentation. Upscaling the game to a full 1080p resolution, the game's environments hold up fairly well, though it seems the character models didn't get completely reworked for the GameCube's hardware, but that's just my speculation. The real evidence of the game's humble beginnings comes from the game's size. It spans over 4 different locations, being the Roivus Manor, the Forbidden City, Oubliette Cathedral, and Angkor Thom, Cambodia. We explore these areas through the eyes of the 12 chosen characters across different time periods. Though we jump around in time in a very alinear fashion, we visit these areas chronologically. For example, we visit Oubliette Cathedral 3 separate times, the first in 814 AD, the second in 1485, and the last in 1916. However, in between these visits, we may switch to another character even earlier in time. Anthony's chapter in the cathedral is third, taking place in 814, and Kareem's chapter in the Forbidden City comes directly after Anthony's, but his takes place in 556, a good 249 years earlier. The way the game handles its timeline brings about its own questions, but it's another one of those things that lends the game its unique flair. There's been many games with a time travel element and multiple protagonists, but never one quite like this. These characters are linked by the Tome of Eternal Darkness, and a struggle to keep a humanity from meeting its ultimate end by the hands of giant space abominations. The best place to start is with Alex Roivus, the character who's going to be reading through the book and seeing the past transpired events. Throughout the course of the game, Alex's dead grandfather Edward serves as our narrator since he was essentially the go-to man for a lot of the other characters in the game. It's actually a little strange how the book gets passed along after he finds it, but that's something to discuss as we move along. You get an action sequence right off the bat with your character locked in a room with 3 zombies. Because I played this thing to death, I just sort of cheesed them out by only taking out their heads, leaving them to stand in place. They keep responding otherwise, and you'll eventually run out of bullets. The intention here is that you panic when you run out of ammo, which makes the transition to the next cutscene make a whole lot more sense. The game throws out a little foreshadowing at you here right off the bat, but first-time players won't really catch this. If you want to get the true ending to the game, it has to be completed 3 times, once under each of the game's different alignments, so the game is full of foreshadowing. The nightmare sequence also serves as some subtle priming for the main themes of the game. Sanity and paranoia are basically written in the title, and cutting from an impossible scenario to something a little more grounded is very common. Only instead of getting that white flash and hearing,
This isn't really happening!
you just get some story elements instead. Alex's grandfather has passed away and the detective can't seem to find the cause, so she decides to look around the mansion for clues. Nowadays, I immediately go running for the clock in the back room to kick off the game, but I was lucky enough to capture some footage of a first-time player, as it's become a little hard to remember what I did my first time through. This segment of the game is very classic survival horror. You just walk around the mansion observing anything with a text prompt in hopes of advancing the story or some puzzle. When you don't know what to do, it can be a good while before you find that clock in the back room. If you have a good memory, then you can recall the clock in the center of the home is stuck to 3:33 and solve the puzzle right then and there. If you have an amazing attention to detail, you can recall Alex's clock also reads 3:33 in the first cutscene, though you're more than likely to discover that after your first playthrough. It's an important segment though. It forces you to explore, encourages your curiosity, and leaves some bits of foreshadowing. You won't understand that picture with the colored circles and arrows the first time, but you definitely will after Chapter 5. Once you make it into the back room, you find the thing that's ruined most everyone's life, the Tome of Eternal Darkness. It's described as a leather-bound book, probably human flesh, bound with shrunken bones. Just touching the thing floods your head with knowledge, though the book seems to be very selective of the knowledge it passes on. Alex has to find pages around the house in order to piece together the chain of events, but the rest of the characters are simply flooded with memories of characters past or characters yet to come. Really, it just kinda seems to give each character as much as they need to complete their chapter. For example, Lindsay's events transpire in 1983. The only two characters that come after him chronologically are Michael and Alex. But his story is told in Chapter 6 when we've only seen 5 other characters before him. Whenever a non-Roivas character, or Elia for some reason, finds the book, it's in a mausoleum in the sky where the fallen chosen have statues engraved to them. If a character dies in the fight against the Ancients, then their statue can be found here by other characters. Both Alex and Michael survived their chapter, so theoretically Edwin should be able to see every character's statue. All 8 of these slots should be filled since Lindsay also survives his chapter. Vice versa, Kareem can see Anthony's statue, but he won't be dead for another 249 years. The characters just see all of the chosen who have the necessary knowledge for them to progress their storyline. At least that's how it's explained by the gameplay. Story-wise, the reasons could be a number of things. It probably happens this way to protect the player from spoilers. If you're playing as Lindsay and find all the 8 slots filled, it removes any kind of guesswork as to his ultimate fate. The player will conclude he survives even though no character has been that lucky thus far. He's the first one you play as that survives to live another day after his chapter, and from there you can figure a certain pattern. The last character to visit each of these areas ultimately survives their ordeal and never has a statue erected in the mausoleum. They try and make things ambiguous by making the characters themselves seem uncertain about their own fates, but as far as I'm concerned, if your likeness isn't in the final variation of the Shadow Realm, then you're good to go. I mean, Peter's probably gonna die of old age soon, but these 3 are money. Anyway, Alex begins things by reading about our first character chronologically, Pius Augustus. He's a Roman soldier as of 26 BC, and his main gameplay function is to introduce players to combat. It starts out in a Roman dialect which swaps over to English. Due to the nature of the book, I like to think that it's giving Alex the knowledge she needs to understand the new language. Whenever I go back to this chapter, the only thing I swing my sword at is the statue which attempts to teach players the most efficient way to kill an enemy. Head first, then arms, then torso. If you play this stage for your first time as a survival horror game, evading conflict whenever you see it, then this barrier gets you to learn the combat mechanics. Thankfully, I do have first-timer footage here, and it's pretty reminiscent of what I did my first time. Just hacking and slashing everything in sight despite not having to. Without targeting any limbs, your character just does some basic slashes to space out enemy hordes, so the statue later on doubles as a way to teach players that they can target limbs. For a survival horror game, Eternal Darkness controls much more intuitively than its Resident Evil and Silent Hill counterparts. The fully 3D rendered environments means tank controls don't need implementation. These combat mechanics also severely reduce the threat level of most enemy types. I would go so far as to say enemies are really more of a nuisance than a threat. I'm glad things weren't made purposely clunky in other franchises, but enemy behavior should have really compensated for character slick control. Enemies are easily dispatched of and easily avoided, so the only time they really put any pressure is if they're occupying a space where you need to solve a puzzle. As the controls stand now, the only quick fix would be to occupy the space with far more enemies, but then you'd likely need to dip back into the maps and make some alterations there as well. The sanity mechanic is not introduced here, even though story-wise that doesn't make any sense. Pius hasn't bound Mantrok yet with huge totems, and his minions are perfectly capable of zapping sanity out of other characters after the fact. The common accepted theory is that the battle-hardened soldier isn't so easily shaken by a few shriveled up corpses, but Mantrok plays the long game. To put things simply, they are three big Lovecraftian space abominations colored red, blue, and green that desire to rule the planet. True to Pokemon fashion, the red one beats the green one beats the blue one, and the blue one can beat the red one. Mantarok's color is purple and has a sort of neutral effect. He can successfully overpower any one of these other ancients. Problem is, there's 3 of them. So it essentially manipulates these 12 characters via the book and other means in order to make one a lich, so that he'll summon one of the 3 ancients to his dimensional plane, and the 11 others, in trying to stop him, will summon another one of the 3 ancients, so they'll fight each other. He does this in 3 different realities, one where Pius aligns with Ulyaoth, one where Pius aligns with Xel'lotath, and one where Pius aligns with Chiturga. By doing this, it basically gets the 3 of them to kill each other so it can be free to rule the planet. Yeah. If this is the case, I'd wager Mantarok probably didn't want its goons draining the sanity out of the person who's supposed to kick off all the necessary events, though it probably didn't have enough influence to get them to stop attacking Pius altogether. I don't know, maybe it just knew Pius would easily handle them and didn't bother, who's to say. After destroying the statue and one more simple puzzle, the player will then get to choose which of the 3 ancients they want Pius to align with. This may also double as a difficulty select. Green being the easiest, blue being medium, and red being hard. It doesn't drastically change the game or puzzles or anything like that, it just changes what type of zombie you're going to run into most often. The red ones take the most hits to kill and hit the hardest. The green ones just focus on stealing sanity but are really simple to dispatch of, and the blue ones prioritize magic while being harder to kill than the green ones, but not as tough as the red ones. For the sake of speed, I'm choosing Xel'lotath, but I'm also going green for the sake of demonstrating the game's biggest flaws. Up until now, a first-time player, myself included, might not be very impressed with the game. It's an interesting concept, but nothing groundbreaking has really happened yet. It's not until our 2nd chapter that the game throws out its central mechanic, and unfortunately, this is where Eternal Darkness really drops the ball.
I cannot say what was the true beginning, nor am I sure of its end.
Elia's chapter is discovered immediately behind you, and it takes you into the shoes of a Cambodian dancer in 1150 AD. She's somehow gotten her hands on the Tome of Eternal Darkness. Though she is our 2nd character, she's chronologically 4th in our timeline, coming after Kareem and Anthony. Reading the book, she yearns for adventure. She wants to be a part of something with a higher purpose.
There has to be something to do around here. I only wish something that fantastic and of higher purpose could happen to me.
Well, you asked for it. I will mention again that this isn't a straight review. I'm not really going to go into the contents of each chapter, just focus on certain points of interest. The one here is how the sanity mechanic is introduced to the player, and I personally find it to be the biggest blunder of Eternal Darkness. The sanity mechanic is unfortunately the game's selling point. If you did catch an ad for this game, the mechanic was at the forefront and mentioned in pretty much every review of the game.
Players take charge of Alexandra, a young woman who has to solve the mystery of her grandfather's untimely death and her cursed family tree.
There's been an accident.
As you venture forth, your sanity meter drops, and when that runs out, you begin to hallucinate.
What I find even more counterintuitive than that is that so much information is given to you from the first enemy encounter. A zombie stands up from the ground, and you get a wall of green text detailing that you have a sanity meter, and the lower it gets, the more you shouldn't trust your environment. I didn't think anything of this my first time through, and being honest, I was just glad I was going to get to experience the game's central gimmick. But the more I reflected on it, the more disappointed I became that things were handled this way. The game, in bright green text, flat out tells you to expect the unexpected. You have a constant visual indication on how you're doing, which really doesn't mirror insanity in the slightest. You'll see bugs dripping from the walls, bugs on your screen, the volume may adjust itself, statues move their heads, you'll appear on the ceiling of the room. All of these things are novel, but don't really capture that paranoia because you fully expect them to happen. In other words, you really can't be taken by surprise. You should never at any point just be sat down and told, "You are now going to go insane." All it does is allow you to shrug off anything out of the ordinary. Your character shouldn't glow bright green when their sanity is being zapped, and the sanity meter, health meter, and magic meter really shouldn't be visually indicated as they are. It's par for the course that a survival horror game gives you a little less information on screen than other genres, and since Eternal Darkness controls much better than its contemporaries of the time, the decision to give a clear visual indication of your status doesn't make a whole lot of sense. What's weirder than that is that the game has more subtle ways to hint at your current status. Your character limps when their health is low, and there's nothing that hits you hard enough to bring you from a state of walking fine to death. You're going to hit this limping state first, so leaving it ambiguous would help induce emergency. The screen will cant itself to lower your sanity, and the spells will just fail on the spot if your self-regenerating magic hasn't charged enough. You could argue that there should at least be a magic meter, but there's no situation which calls for frequent magic casting. At least, there's no situation that should cause you to drain your magic meter from repeated casting back to back. All of these elements should be left a little foggy. Imagine your first time playing. Let's say the marketing department wasn't allowed to speak a word of the sanity mechanic. Then have everything in the game work as is, save the clear telegraphing. Just have the camera slowly cant itself over time to represent sanity. If it's too sudden, like when you hit the end of a chapter on low sanity, then the player will find something off. It's gotta be gentle enough as to not arouse suspicion. The player may not even notice they're walking at an angle, and it would make the sanity effects like running into a room of enemies, followed by a controller disconnect prompt, all the more terrifying. Imagine if that sanity effect was your first one. The game hasn't told you a thing about sanity, and then suddenly you're in a room full of crowded enemies, and your controller malfunctions. This could really induce true panic in a player. From there, they'll kindle a skepticism on what's really real or not. The potential and concept of the sanity effect is perfectly fine. It's the other elements that work around it which I feel cheapen or even flat out ruin it. Oh, my controller malfunctioned. It's fine, my sanity meter is low, so this can't be real. It's not enough to simply remove information. There also needs to be some changes to how low sanity plays with the player. Eventually, even sans information, the player may catch on that sudden impossible situations can't happen, so they'll begin to shrug those off, and then they'll wait for the flash of white light to take them back to a safe point. There's a sanity effect I didn't get this playthrough where the player runs into a room and it's full of enemies that are just hallucinations. If you strike them, they simply vanish, and it's this sort of thing I wish occurred more often. Having so many sanity effects that abruptly end in a white flash has a detrimental effect on design, but scenarios like a room full of hallucinations or fighting a ton of ammo that doesn't exist keeps the pace of the game. You could even get a little meta with it. Say you walk into a swarm of enemies again and you expect to see the controller prompt pop up telling you that this is all in your head, only to realize after a while that the enemies are really there and you need to make a quick getaway. The player expects the flash of white light, but it never comes. If you throw in that possibility that what's happening may actually be real, the player can't safely shrug off any off-putting scenario. This would really put them more in the shoes of a character that's going insane. There's no certainty in insanity. A funny example of this actually happened to me unintentionally when I was still playing this game on my aging GameCube. See, one of the sanity effects is to show you a blue screen of death, something a lot of people probably haven't seen. I got the sanity effect, and after a few seconds I got the flash of white light and continued playing. On a later playthrough I got the blue screen of death again and sat for about 2 minutes waiting for the game to resume. I thought maybe the effect just lasted different amounts of time to fuck with you, but it got absurd after 5 minutes of waiting. Turns out my GameCube actually had an error and the game just broke. So I was just sitting there looking at a legitimate blue screen of death waiting for things to fix themselves. I was pretty pissed that I had to redo some sections again. I'm obviously not saying the game should break itself for real or anything like that, but this is what playing with your expectations of sanity effects can do. You think that you're certain, but in reality you're just an asshole sitting in front of a broken GameCube. This is really all to say that the player is just given too much information and by extension, too much agency. Eternal Darkness isn't a game that lacks its share of subtlety, so it's a shame that things had to work in this way. If a successor does make it out of development hell, I hope that the spotlight on sanity gets toned down. Elia ends her chapter with Mantarok's heart in her chest and is left conscious in her rotting corpse for a good 833 years. But hey, at least she's serving a higher purpose now. There's a fucking fruit fly on my mic and I'm gonna kill the shit out of that. Our third character, and third in the timeline, is Anthony. One of my favorite chapters purely for the concept. He has a message for Charlemagne the Frank, which he sneaks a peek at. This causes him to get cursed by yellow magic, a leftover from an earlier time when there was a fifth ancient. Magic in this game is color-coded red, blue, green, and purple to represent the alignment it comes from, but here and there you'll see points when yellow is used. Dennis Dyack confirmed there was a fifth alignment, but it doesn't really serve any importance. The point is, Anthony is now cursed, and he intends to warn Charlemagne of the apparent treachery against him. For me, and probably for a lot of others, this is when the game got its hooks into me. This is the first appearance of the mausoleum in the sky, and the player can take a gander at a few of the fallen chosen. It's a nice touch that Pius' statue is destroyed because the player destroyed it earlier. It's the little touches like these that really elevate the storytelling in the game. Once Anthony grabs the book, he gets quick flashes of the 2 previous chapters. Again, if things work chronologically, he'd see flashes of Pius and Kareem, but instead he gets part of the past and part of the future. This will now begin his slow decay into a living corpse. As the chapter progresses, the curse will advance Anthony's state of death from a few days to a few good decades. The magic circle and spells are introduced here, which is another mechanic which could do with some streamlining. If you explore your area well, you'll find both runes and scrolls which translate the runes and specify their spell potential. You can dip into the menu and attempt to find a spell by combining runes, but it's easier to just find all the necessary pieces so that the spell creates itself. You'll occasionally find the runes to complete a spell before the translating scroll, so handcrafting does have some value later on, but the only really useful instance of this is circumventing some backtracking in Lindsay's chapter. My only real gripe with the system is how it doesn't automatically apply Paragon runes when you expand on your 3-point circle. If you want a stronger variation of the same spell, you're going to have to craft it yourself. You don't need to upgrade every spell, but this is something a first-time player may not know. I mean, I know I definitely didn't enjoy having to upgrade all my spells every time, and every time a new circle was found, it was a really lengthy process. If you save one of the monks here, he'll give you a 2-handed sword, which can be carried over to the later characters that visit the cathedral, but it can also be lost forever if he dies. The scene here also demonstrates the torch's usefulness against Mantarok zombies. It's also really good for Xelatoth zombies, so oftentimes I will opt to use my torch rather than my sword if I can manage it. The other notable feature of this chapter is that Anthony lacks any healing items, and for a good reason. The hope is that you will die, so you discover Anthony's apparent immortality. Nothing can permanently kill him, he'll just get back up, though it'll be in an excruciating manner. This mechanic is also doing the business of some foreshadowing, which leads into one of my favorite moments in gaming, though the execution on that moment is a little bit of a drop ball. Trappers see their introduction here and they place you with one in a tight hallway. The intention is that it'll catch you in its rays and show you the trapper dimension. I'm too legit for that shit though, and I never visit that realm in this playthrough, so there's something for you to experience if you decided to watch this video without playing the game. Once Anthony's portion is finished, Alex then needs to use the spell learned in that chapter to find the next page, which will then bring us to Kareem. One thing I noticed about Eternal Darkness is that black folk really get off easy in this game, as opposed to the usual horror trope of having them die horrible deaths. The characters that aren't lucky enough to survive become souls trapped in their own rotting cadavers, buried alive, have their head exploded, locked away to rot in a loony bin. Folks really suffer from finding the Tome of Eternal Darkness. Kareem, on the other hand, dies getting a piece of ass. He also gets the strongest melee weapon in the Rammed IO, allowing him to chop through one of the game's tougher enemies like butter. He's well equipped, he kicks ass, and he dies getting it in. Kareem is our second visit to the Forbidden City, and the main thing he gets here is the recovery spell. The spell, depending on alignment, restores your health, magic, sanity, or all three of them at once. This could very well be the point in the game where the player's agency over sanity is taken up to 11, as it then becomes the player's decision on whether or not they want to be insane, which could effectively invalidate the sanity mechanic altogether. Even if they don't get it here, by chapter 6 the player likely has the game-breaking Mantarok rune anyway. I can see why the developers wanted to leave a way to recover sanity. After watching a first-time player, they may end up wandering a bit, checking every nook and cranny. It may be novel when you begin losing your limbs for the first time, but for the 13th time it may be more of an annoyance than unsettling. There's gotta be another solution than simply giving the player a recover spell, as it means the player can fully top off their stats after every enemy encounter should they choose to. You can already recover sanity from finishing down enemies, and the amount they return to you equals their initial drain amount. If they zap you and you kill them, you'll wind up back where you started, so the only enemies that can leave you under par are gatekeepers, the worm, and potentially guardians. I recall in one of the interviews that the team did want to play a little more heavily with the sanity mechanic, like having puzzles that couldn't be solved unless you were somewhat crazy. The example they gave was maybe you'd see a door in an unusual place on the roof, so you'd fish for the sanity effect that makes you walk on the ceilings. There's already puzzles that can only be solved while being insane. Max has to obtain a rune this way in the following chapter. This could be an interesting puzzle solving mechanic, but hopefully it's done without giving too much agency to the player. Since I picked Xelotop, I can just play things out like a normal survival horror at this point, which will cause me to miss out on a lot of little goodies. Something about the way sanity is taken and given to the player needs some strong alterations. If you can craft spells, maybe extend that concept to health and sanity items. Force players to choose between crafting something that heals them a little or restores some sanity. Besides the recover spell, Kareem can find a ruby effigy, which can be passed on to the next character that steps foot in the Forbidden City. I really like the mechanic of passing on items which both the cathedral and city implement. The city one-ups the cathedral in this regard in that each time a new character comes here they must also locate a statue to pass on with the last, and if all three effigies are found, Michael unlocks a special weapon. The manor in Angkor Tome could have benefited from something like this too, but Angkor Tome was only visited twice, so there's probably no point there. Next in line we have Maximilian Roivas, one of Alex's great-grandfathers. Story-wise, I love everything about this character. His sanity effects, the way game pulls you into his shoes, it's the stuff that only video games are capable of. Earlier in the mansion you see his ghost, but you're not quite certain who that is yet, he just sort of walks into a wall. Once you get his chapter page, you can recognize him as the aberration you saw earlier. Of course, if you never venture into that hallway because you know you don't need to go there, you'll see him well after the chapter like I did. Once Max finds the book, bone thieves infiltrate the manor and impersonate his cleaning staff. Why the book is already there isn't really explained. The chosen before him had his head exploded in Oubliette Cathedral. When you leave the area with the book, the first servant you see walks after you with an intention to harm you. If you let him catch you, he's going to start throwing punches. Hacking away at him reveals a bone thief inside his body, and this will implant some hostility in the player. From this point on, they may opt to attack every servant they see on sight, but you can pass by some of them just doing their job. Only some of the servants have been possessed, so if you kill an innocent person, you'll really drain your sanity bar quickly. Because some of the servants are innocent, this really puts the player at a state of paranoia on which ones are hostile. It's really uneasy when you walk into a room and you see a servant book towards you only to clean a spot on the floor. I'm sure a few wandering servants met their untimely end for just trying to be diligent. This implementation of paranoia is the game's strongest use of it as far as I'm concerned. Sanity, high or low, the player can't be certain, and seeing a servant in the room causes uneasiness, the same uneasiness Max would be feeling. When you get the sanity effect from entering the well, you get glimpses into his future at the asylum, and the player may conclude it's from his actions at the end of the chapter. He ends up finding an underground city filled with the undead creatures, so he runs off to warn everyone in town. You may think this is why they wrapped him up and threw him in the asylum, but I'm sure this ending didn't quite feel right to some people. Though I thought nothing of it, it really doesn't make a whole lot of sense to jail someone for trying to spread a rumor, even if it is 1760. As you play along and finally gain access into the room the aberration headed towards a few chapters later, you'll see the real reason for his incarceration. Not only was he raving on about a city of monsters, he killed everyone in his manor because he could no longer grasp who to trust. The way Max's story is portrayed is really something only a video game can do right. It allows you to feel his paranoia one-to-one. Unfortunately, because the player likely has agency over their sanity at this point, the effect from entering the well can entirely be missed if the player has topped off their sanity meter before descending the ladder. It makes for a nice trick to skip the effect on repeat playthroughs, but it's sad to know some people unintentionally miss this little trinket to a storyline. We've now made it to Lindsay. And as you can see, he's a motherfucker that doesn't play that shit. Angkor Tome has some more wildlife growing inside of it, but Lindsay is going to make his way to Elia by taking the stairs instead of rolling down a trapdoor. Because this is Mantarok's domain, it makes sense to find his rune here, but it does break the game a lot, so I wish they could have found a way to reserve it for a new game plus. They placed the rune behind some backtracking, but most players are unlikely going to miss an obvious puzzle element that was highlighted to them. You need a summoning spell, and you have to advance somewhat past this door before you have the tools to open it. Once you get the Mantarok rune, player agency goes up from 11 to 1506. I'm going to be abusing it to its fullest by turning myself invisible when at a conflict to show how much of the game is trivialized past chapter 6. The rune gives a unique effect to a few spells. I mentioned that it grants healing, sanity recovery, and magic recovery when combined with the recover spell. It grants you invisibility when combined with the reveal invisible spell. It also takes priority over every other alignment, making the use of dispel magic and magic attack less of a hassle. If Lindsay grabs this rune before finding Elia's rotting cadaver, the player is going to be laughing all the way to the bank from here on out. The first character, which has the privilege of abusing Mantarok spells, is Paul Luther. He starts out unarmed, and it's assumed you'll explore this area here first, which is why the game makes a big deal out of this shitty Mantarok zombie. Paul shouldn't have a mace in his hands yet like I do. Even if you weren't armed, turning yourself invisible and going fisticuffs would work perfectly fine. Hell, just go fisticuffs, these things are really ass. Paul will come across Anthony's rotting corpse, and depending on whether or not the player got the two-handed sword, he'll either be unarmed or have the weapon in hand. If the player died earlier as Anthony, as the game intended, then the moment here is made all the more special. If you beat him down, he just gets back up again, and this may cause the player to rightfully assume that there's another method to defeating him. I think the game does drop the ball by making the solution so simple. All you need to do to stop Anthony is just beat him down twice, and this suddenly makes the effect of his curse stop working, even though the player could die an indefinite amount of times with no consequences. Despite the drop ball, I really find something special in this moment. It's one thing to just maybe show off or describe Anthony's immortality if this were in some other medium like film or written stories. But demonstrating the plot relevant information with game mechanics, which can potentially be missed, is the strength of the medium. Being immortal yourself, then coming across your past avatar as someone else is just something only a video game can give you. I just wish the solution to ridding Anthony's curse was a little more complex than just beating him up more than his past enemies.
Tony, no!
Oh, you're the best, Tony Stark.
Oh, we still got the spell on!
Oh my god, you're right. Am I supposed to do something special here? I don't know.
He's still got the...
Dispel, maybe?
Yeah! Well, no, but when he's down.
Right. But let's assign... I don't think I have it on quick spell, dispel.
I think you do, actually. Dispel. It's the right one.
But...
Which one to use?
He doesn't seem to have anything.
Well, we'll figure it out.
Well, okay.
It's a yellow rune. So... Oh, never mind. We're wrong.
Never mind. That would have been cool, though.
He's been beaten enough.
That's enough.
There's some other little foreshadowing goodies here in the form of a sanity effect in this main hall. I spend a good while trying to fish for it, but I never get it. Paul can see glimpses of the hallway's future as a hospital on rare circumstances, but I get tired of fishing for it here, so there you go. Another thing to look out for if you decide to watch this video without having played the game. Next on the chopping block is Roberto, and he's been tasked with surveying a site for construction. It's our third visit to the Forbidden City, and like Kareem, he has an effigy to find here. There's not really much to say about him, he's just got kind of a bland chapter. He does his job, and then he's buried alive after the completion of his task. You see a cameo of like a knight character that was around the game's N64 days, but besides that, Roberto doesn't really have much else going on. Peter Jacob, on the other hand, will be visiting the cathedral for the third time in World War I. I like the idea that this massive conflict, and conflict in general, is helped along by these ancient beings in order to create a bloodbath for their sustenance. Peter's chapter is special in that he gets the only real boss fight in the game, sans the final boss. And really, if you think about it, Peter killing this thing doesn't make a whole lot of sense, like at all, given that the last person to cross its path had their head exploded. Instead of immediately killing Peter, it engages with him in combat and fails to kill him when he puts up a fight. You need to use magic attacks on it at certain points, and these openings present themselves in increasingly convoluted ways. Avoiding some blasts, then attacking back is simple enough, but then you need to allow it to summon other zombies and then let them walk for a bit before chaining an attack through them to hit the boss. If you keep dispatching of the zombies physically, you gotta let it summon more, and I imagine this quirk caused some trouble for some people. Besides the boss here, Peter can get a sanity effect where the cathedral assumes its past state, as it was when Paul was roaming the halls. I also didn't manage to successfully get it, so who knows, maybe I'm going crazy. Good thing I got some of that liquid courage, baby. Edward is next as our chapter 10. He was the narrator for the other Chosen as Alex read their stories, but here things are left in silence since he's now under the spotlight. He finds the book in the same old room and comes across a unique type enemy, the vampire. The vampire will suck out a person's blood. No, really. But then it leaves them in a possessed state. You need to be running the dominant reveal invisible spell because it's invisible. That makes sense. And if you let it run amok a bit, you can collect rewards from those you save. The most valuable of these being the elephant gun. Having the enemy itself be invisible is a good way to stop the player from abusing invisibility themselves, as it forces you into a fair fight. But I can't help but feel there could have been more of a puzzle here for this enemy. Initially, it knocks over a vase revealing a key, and you obtain the other half by just beating it up 3 separate times. They probably could have set it up to where maybe chasing it somewhere would cause it to knock over something else. It's just a little off-putting that the designers take the time to set up this scenario and then go for the simplest solution. Steering the thing around the house may have proved to have been a chore or maybe a little awkward, but it could help cut down the playtime for repeat playthroughs. Like if the player knew where they needed to head the vampire. Anyway, I don't get any big rewards from anyone as I'm running for pure time, and I know the double barrel shotgun is good enough to carry the run. I like the weapon balancing in this game. Usually swords would outclass the firearms, but each weapon here has a distinct purpose. The handgun is good for dispatching trappers, the sword could be used on zombies, and the shotgun's better for those more potent threats like horrors and guardians. You've had the components all along, but this is where you find the magic pool spell, and depending on the alignment, casting this will either constantly charge your health, magic, sanity, or all 3 at once. I'm already busting the game enough as is with invisibility, so I don't opt to use it this time. This chapter is also a bit of a marathon. You just create a massive dispel magic with giant towers. You set a rune in place, then you're warped somewhere else, and you need to make your way back to the center room. I'm sure some players enjoyed this segment, but I wasn't really a fan, especially when you're asked to repeat the task a second time. This chapter gives Alex the answers she was searching for, and we discover when a Zelatoff's minions did her grandfather in years after he essentially blew up their city. The clues on what runes to place here are pretty obscure. I know to use Dispel Magic from memory, but how a first-timer would get to this conclusion is a little muddy. I guess given your options, it's the only one that makes sense, but maybe I just constantly been missing the clues all these years. Michael Edwards is our penultimate chosen man, and like Kareem before him, he's going to be a total badass. I think this chapter gives a great sense of turning the tides on the enemy. Our characters have mainly been fodder for the ancients, but that trend ends with Michael. He starts out with a soldier's loadout and a fire axe. Really, you have no reason to resort to a melee weapon here, as the assault rifle alone can carry the chapter. You have to make your way through one major puzzle before the tome is handed to you, so you spend the first half of the chapter potentially having your sanity and health drained. Despite your loadout, the lack of healing can start putting some pressure on you, especially if you're combat averse. Once you hit the mausoleum, however, the odds are put in your favor, and you essentially get to power trip. Before, fighting the thing was a thing of dread, but now it's more comforting since all 8 of the slots are filled and the player can comfortably assume that Michael comes out of this scot-free, and this chapter becomes one of the more cathartic. You just essentially roll through and blast everyone to bits, blow up the Forbidden City, and rendezvous with Edward before his head is taken off. The last effigy isn't even that well hidden, so if the player managed to scrounge out the Sapphire effigy in Roberto's chapter, then Michael will probably end up getting Alex's special weapon. One of the things I typically don't do in this game is enchant my weapon. It does buff damage to varying degrees depending on the strength of the enchantment, but the only real time I may opt to do this is facing the vampire in Edward's chapter. You can at most double your damage output, but usually when you're given one of the major power weapons in the game like the Ramdayo or the two-handed sword, the default damage is usually sufficient enough. I know some players who opted to do this a lot in their playthroughs, but I personally just don't see the benefit. You can honestly just kill most enemies in the time it takes you to buff yourself. This chapter is also as good a place as any to discuss the implications of health, sanity, and magic meters. Again, I wish these things weren't so clearly displayed to the player, but you can use them to sort of get some background on your character. Michael's got high health, infinite stamina, decent magic, and low sanity. You expect a firefighter to be in fantastic physical shape, and his low sanity is popularly attributed to Gulf War syndrome. Then you have characters like Edward with low health and stamina, but high magic and stamina meters. He's a psychologist, so he's got a good head on his shoulders, and this allows him to be gifted in the arcane arts. What I'm getting at is the meters do serve as some passive storytelling devices, and you can attribute certain stats to the situation at hand. Like how Peter Jacobs' low sanity can be explained by the ongoing World War. It's a nice touch, but I still stand firm that the cost at which the meters come at is too high. Michael successfully completes his task, and for some reason it's thrown around that his fate is left ambiguous. But for me at least, the mausoleum confirms that he did not fall to the ancients. He probably went on to live a normal life, even if he did end up a little paranoid. Alex will take the torch after finishing up that chapter, and now her sanity is nearly drained. The touch of having Alex's sanity drained by increasingly more severe quantities is a nice touch, though it is defeated by the recover spell. It felt more thematically appropriate to leave Alex's sanity meter where it was after each chapter until the very end, when we were supposed to be turning the tides of fate. There's some interesting effects Alex can get, but I'm really not going to cover them in depth. You get the bathtub, the statue, the books on occasion, they're little novelties. This is our send-off chapter, but it's definitely my least favorite to complete. Up until now, revisiting areas has usually resulted in added content. The third time you visit the cathedral and Alex's chapter are the exception to the rule. The Forbidden City expanded each time you treaded those grounds. Cambodia added a lot more new space, and I didn't even mind the retread in the cathedral. It was really more asking me to do the exact same puzzle Edward did with some different runes, and a hazardous floor, causing me to cast shield over and over. Her mini puzzles in each room are a little different, but I dread Alex's chapter each time I go back to it. I forgot to mention the worm room in Edward's chapter. When he walks in here and the worm takes him to the realm of insanity, but he quickly gets himself out of it with his flask. I've always wondered what would happen if you got here and you were out of flask, which should never really happen unless you were consciously trying to avoid using the recover spell. The cutscene doesn't consume your total number of flasks, but part of me still wonders. I just hate playing through the stage so much that I never really bothered to try it. Nothing probably changes here anyway. Alex's chapter may have been bland and a bit of a retread, but this final encounter is one of my favorites in gaming. Again, just for the concept. The mechanical execution of the fight isn't really that difficult, especially if you have the enchanted Gladius. I just think it's fitting that Alex defeats Pius with his own weapon. Having every spirit that was damned by the tome get their turn at taking a swing only makes the catharsis that much greater. It's probably me just looking into things too much, but I like to think that Alex only prevails in this fight because the tome passed on not only knowledge but the other's combat capability as well. As she read, Alex learned spells, languages, and probably got some influence of the more capable fighter. I mean, how else is this asshole studying number theory going to match a Roman lich with 2 millennia of battle experience? This more personal showdown takes place as 2 cosmic beings have an epic fight in space. This general look probably tended towards a review as it went on, but this was essentially a really long-winded way of praising the game's storytelling elements while wishing those elements didn't tamper with the gameplay and player expectations. The narrative is fine. The puzzles work for what they are. It drops the ball at some points, but some more development time can fix that. If there really is a sequel still in the works somewhere, I can only hope that it adopts far more gameplay subtlety. This is a good storyteller, but it's too eager to bring its mechanics to the forefront. As long as those fundamentals are fixed, then those people that played the sequel first without a knowledge of what Eternal Darkness was will have something really special awaiting them. I just hope the team takes as much time as they need, and I look forward to that next venture into darkness.
It cannot be allowed to remain in this universe! Oh no, you don't want to do that again? Good heavens, no, not that one. Nor that one either. Come on, Edward. It hasn't been that long since you researched this stuff. It's the squiggly circle thing. Ah, that's the ticket.